Derick Dillard isn't holding back. Dillard accused the Duggar family patriarch of being manipulative and verbally abusive, claiming he has lied to Derick and his wife Jill, quote, numerous times.
If you're saying on paper, oh, well, it's spread out this much and so we shouldn't have to pay as much taxes, but then ultimately I'm still going to get the benefit of controlling all this money, then that's not what that was set in place to do, and it's not fair.
Contrary to his campaign, he does not believe in freedom, but his manipulation has resulted in what is akin to human trafficking.
It was almost like your siblings were almost turned against you. It was almost this idea of, oh, you're a threat to the business and the show.
Somebody inside that circle questioning, then you're cast out. You get kind of kicked out, or black sheep. This culture that I came from, where you're just this persistent, you're treated almost like a persistent teenager, forever.
In May of 2015, Jill and Derick, along with their 1-month-old, were gearing up to depart for Central America to serve as missionaries. It was a lifelong goal of Jill's, and she was excited to begin this new journey. But that excitement would quickly fade upon news that a very dark, disturbing secret about her family was about to be made public. The secret involved information about her brother, Josh Duggar's past abuse of her and some of her sisters. Her father, Jim Bob, called Jill to tell her that a media outlet was in possession of a police report detailing the abuse. Though Jim Bob attempted to stop the release of this report, he was unsuccessful, and Jill's life as she knew it would greatly change. The disclosure of this secret left Jill feeling naked, humiliated, and ashamed.
I knew that I would have to address this part of my life in the book because it's been a very public, unfortunately, part of my story. But I also was very careful in the way that I handled it. And I was adamant that I would not tell it in a way that that continued to expose very private parts of my story, and things that should have never been released and should have never been out there as a victim. And I believe that victims should always be protected, and especially juvenile victims. And that was something that was unfortunately and illegally taken from me. So I definitely believe that there was a re-victimization that happened in the way that it was handled. So I think that everything should have remained private for me, not to protect the abuser, but as a victim, as a juvenile victim. Like I put in the book, like the judge's opinion on everything, he called it out and said what it was. He said this was illegal, what they did as far as like talking about these things, releasing these things. But I hold them accountable for their actions. And I hope and pray going forward that no other victims would have to deal with the trauma that I face because of this, and the reliving and rehashing and all of this that just haunts me to this day. It's emotional for me to even talk about it. So
when the story broke, it brought back painful memories for Jill. Memories that she didn't want plastered on every news outlet for her to relive. In an attempt to get away from it all, the Duggars went to stay at a ranch in Oklahoma, owned by one of Jim Bob's friends. Everyone was there, including Josh Duggar. Jill hadn't seen Josh in months and didn't know how to be around him. After all, the world now knew what her brother had done to her. In her book, she writes, quote, "I didn't know how to be around Josh. Although what had happened had been addressed back then, and he had apologized many times, We didn't talk about what had happened anymore. It felt like the distant past, but even so, I didn't expect him to be quite as relaxed as he was. And later in the days, I didn't expect him to start laughing, even though it was clearly nervous laughter. It felt weird that he was acting like this, but it was Mom who dealt with it. "Josh," she barked, "it's not your fault that this was released, but you need to know that you were behind all this. Don't be so arrogant." Josh's smile vanished. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm sorry to you, girls, that y'all are having to go through all this." With the clan all in one place, Jim Bob, along with his publicist, Chad, tried to formalize a game plan for them moving forward. With news that the show was at risk of being canceled, Jim Bob knew that he needed to act fast. In an effort to establish some sort of unity, Jim Bob gathered everyone around and delivered a speech. In part, he said, quote, "There are people out there who would like us to fade away. The world would like to see us close our doors and disappear. But we're not going to do that. We're not giving up on this ministry. The window of opportunity that God had opened for this family to show the world what it means to follow Him is still there. They think we're damaged goods, but I will work with TLC to see what we can do to get this thing back up and going again. It was wrong what Josh did, but we will get past this. We will move on. We need to help TLC understand that this happened in the past, that this was something we have already dealt with." According to Jill, upon his speech, Jim Bob, along with Chad, began going over specifics of how they could change the narrative, brainstorming the best method and strategy. Eventually, they came to the conclusion that an interview with Megyn Kelly at Fox would be the best course of action. They knew they needed a female family member to speak out. But who? After a long period of silence, Jill Duggar volunteered herself. In her book, Jill explains her thought process behind this decision, writing, quote, "I felt bad for my parents. Bad that they had to do all this. Bad that Pops' show was on the line. Bad that the world wasn't able to see that my parents were good people, just trying to do good things. I knew that they needed someone to stand up for them, someone to vouch for them. They needed someone to do what they could to save the show. I was one of the older kids, so I naturally felt more weight and responsibility to do something. And I wanted to help them, to show them my love and loyalty in this hardest of times. But I had no boundaries, no sense of what I needed to do to protect myself. I was terrified and didn't want to do the interview at all. But I felt like it was the only way to prove my love and commitment to my parents. I could clear their name and tell everyone that my brother's problems were a thing of the past. I would be willing," I said. "I'll do the interview." "Me too," said Jessa. "I'll do it with you." Pops looked at us both. "Are you sure?" We nodded. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you." "Thank you," said another voice. I looked up. It was Josh. On the day we had taken our seats beneath the bright lights at the big house and did what we could to stand up for our parents, answering all Megan's questions, with Josh watching from a couch just out of shot, was like having a bandage ripped off a deep and open wound. It was agony, so painful that I didn't really pause to ask why Josh was allowed to be there in the first place.
When you found out this was going to be on the cover of In Touch Weekly, what was your reaction?
I'll tell you, we were pretty furious.
I called
we
my
were
husband
not
and I was in tears.
I couldn't believe what was going on. I called it.
It was whenever I heard the police report had been released that I said, what? Like, they don't have a right to do this. This isn't, we're victims. They can't do this to us.
And yet they did.
And they did.
What was it? I mean, what was it about the disclosure that was so painful?
Well, I see it as a re-victimization that's even 1,000 times worse.
Why?
Because this is something that was already dealt with. We've already forgiven Josh. We've already moved on.
Is it humiliating, or what is the emotion that you're feeling?
Well, it's not the truth, first of all. Everything was distorted. And so we felt like our story was not being told. And we felt like it shouldn't have been told. The victims are the only ones who can speak for themselves. And so now that it's already been warped and told, however they want to portray it, then we felt like that's why Jess and I wanted to come out and just say, like, that's not what happened. Mm-hmm. We've dealt with this. We've taken care of it.
Do you feel like you're speaking on behalf of your other sisters too, your younger sisters?
We can't speak for the other ones, but I feel like as far as
I can speak for the others, and as far as saying that everybody's angry that this has been publicized.
Yes.
How about when it comes to forgiving Josh?
Oh, everybody's forgiving. We all forget it, and we've all moved on.
That was long ago, and
Back the babysitter.
back then.
Her too?
The
babysitter as well?
Definitely.
Would you ever have supported a prosecution against Josh?
I think by the time that all of that was done, the report was made and everything, it was very obvious to everyone, us and our family, friends, officials, that Josh was a completely changed person. He had not gone down that path for years. He was humble before God, before us, before...
Do you care about the TLC show? Do you want to see it continue?
You know, we've always just had the mindset of this show is just a window of opportunity that God's allowed our family to be on television and to share with other people our lives.
Well, what about the thought that that opportunity may now disappear? Not just for Josh and your parents, but for you as well.
Life goes on, really. We're not a TV family. We're a family that just happened to be on TV. And so we'll see. You know, we'll see what life brings. And so we don't know at this point.
This is it, right? There's not like another big Duggar family secret that is going to come out.
No.
Okay, so you feel like if you can weather this storm with TLC.
You know, we've been through a lot together, I think. And I think our viewers have seen that, even just the journeys that our family has taken. It's not always been easy on television, but I think it's bringing our family even closer together.
Definitely.
And we'll make it through this too.
We were saying that. We were all sitting around like when all this came out. And I was just like, guys, the people out there, they might be stirring things up, but hey, look on the bright side. At least none of us are feuding. At least we're all in harmony as a family, and we all love each other like crazy.
Tasked with damage control, Jill says she and her sister Jessa felt they had to give an interview to Fox News to protect the family brand.
It was like, okay, we need you to like fall in line here and do these interviews for the show, go here, do this thing and that thing to kind of like rally the troops and get it back together.
Jess and I were talking, we're like, oh my goodness, most of the stuff out there is lies. It's not truth. Mm-hmm. And so for truth's sake, we want to come out and set the record straight.
I was surprised to read that Josh was in the room.
Yeah.
Off camera.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
What do you see in that 24-year-old girl who's talking?
I didn't want to be there. I wanted to help my parents.
Upon Jill and Jessa's interview with Megyn Kelly, they experienced severe backlash and outrage from the public and press. They would be accused of not only protecting and defending their parents, who many believed mishandled the abuse, but the public also accused Jill and Jessa of protecting and defending the abuser. Shortly after the interview, Jill and Derick packed up their belongings and relocated to Central America to begin their work as missionaries. But not long after their arrival, they were hit with more shocking and disappointing news. Jill's brother, Josh Duggar, was in another scandal. This time, it would be reported that Josh was a member of the Ashley Madison site, designed for people who want to have extramarital affairs. Despite being so far away, Jill's life would once again be disrupted by her brother. In her book, she writes, quote, "I felt my heart plunge in my chest, but I decided to play it differently this time, to be active instead of passively waiting for the story to emerge. I wanted to know the truth. So instead of ignoring it or waiting for my parents to tell me what was going on, or trying to get information through the grapevine from my siblings, Derick and I decided that it would be best if I texted Josh right away. I wanted to hear directly from him, to know whether there was any truth in the rumors. I got no reply. A day or two later, Mom called and told me that the rumors were true, that Josh had confessed he'd been addicted to pornography for years. By the time the call ended, I felt just as weary and just as mad at Josh as Mom. "What happens now?" Derick asked. I replied, "He is being sent away again."
That guy is sick and deserves treatment, but he's not even able to get the treatment because they're so busy praying away the problems. He was not mentioned in this special at all. He has serious problems, and my understanding, Mike, is that it's some sort of faith-based program.
Faith-based recovery.
Which could be good, right? I mean, faith-based elements can be important, but it can't supplant the treatment. This kid needs a lot of ongoing, sustained treatment. I hope one day he is the spokesperson for recovery from sex addiction. But right now, I am doubtful. And by the way, he allowed his two sisters to get up there and defend him. That to me is the part that has me just bent. You let the victims defend you all the while you're screwing around on Ashley Madison.
2015 was a rocky year for the Duggars, but by the end of it, they had some hope. After canceling their show, TLC decided to rebrand 19 Kids and Counting and rename the show Jill and Jessa Counting On. According to Jill, the new show would focus on the older Duggar children and their respective families. Josh, Jim Bob, and Michelle Duggar would not participate in the show. But despite the older children being the focal point, Jim Bob would be the only one to receive financial compensation. Everyone else was still considered to be a volunteer. Since Jill and Derick were volunteers and hadn't signed an exclusive contract with the network, they made it clear that the show would not come before their obligations and duties as missionaries in Central America. Though this was a deal that everyone agreed to, Jim Bob had other plans. While living in Central America on a modest salary as missionaries, Jill and Derick formed the Dillard Family Ministries, a 501c3 for fundraising and financial support. When the public found out about it, there was significant backlash. Many believed that it was shameful of Jill and Derick to create this charity when their show generated millions. What many didn't know was that other than Jim Bob, no one made a penny from the show. According to Jill, she and Derick were struggling financially. So when Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar came to visit them in Central America, the topic of finances came up. In her book, Jill recounts the conversation. "I don't remember who brought it up, but somehow we started talking about the show, the filming schedule, and our availability. Suddenly, without warning, the topic shifted onto a subject that I had always avoided discussing with my parents: money. Derick and I had never seen any income for our work on the show. I'm just wondering, Pops, do you think we could maybe see some kind of income from the show at some point?" asked Derick. Pops tensed. When he regained his composure, his words were carefully measured. "Derick, from the very beginning, our family has viewed this as a ministry, an opportunity to share with the world that children are a blessing. Back when we started the show, we didn't make anything off it. I was the one who was able to negotiate a good deal for our family. I could retire right now. The only reason I'm still doing this is for you kids." "Well, how about us receiving a certain % of what comes in? Could that work?" asked Derick. Pops paused. His jaw set tight. We used to pay Josh, but decided not to do that after a while because it wasn't a very good idea. Michelle is the one that had all these kids. We wouldn't even have this show if it weren't for her, replied Pops. Yes, that's true, but we've also added a lot of value to the show and done a lot to contribute. And after all, the show is called Jill and Jessa Counting On, said Derick. Turning to Derick, Pops asked, what are you worth? $10 an hour? 12? That's what I pay some of the others who work for me. Well, said Derick, what's the show worth? Huh? Said Pops. You can't appraise the value of a worker to a business until you know what the whole business is worth. So I guess before we can tell you what we're worth, we need to know what kind of deal you've got with TLC, replied Derick. Pops' mood soured. He was already upset, and the effort to stay calm was starting to show. Derick, when we got into this all those years ago, we just really wanted to reach people, to show that children are a blessing. It's not something we went looking for. God brought this opportunity to us, and we really feel like He has blessed it and helped us reach so many people, many who would otherwise never step foot in a church. Nearly every day, we are getting emails from people who say they've been impacted. They've shared how they've given their lives to Jesus or started going to church again or decided to have more children just by seeing Christian values portrayed through the show. Think about how many people we've been able to reach on a secular television network. I'm not saying your work here isn't great, but we are reaching more people through the show than you are here on the mission field.
So we talk about in the book how we did the show voluntarily and how we were made to believe that our payment should just be, at the time, initially, like volunteer, and we would get perks. So like, you know, if they're grocery shopping while they're filming, they would cover that, travel. And then my dad had several like handouts that he would give us. But we were also under the impression that for a long time we could call it quits whenever we wanted. And just kind of like when it got to be too much, we were trying to like help my parents out, keep it going.
And again, like we weren't stupid. We realized that we weren't getting compensation, but at the same time, like Jill said, we were just trying to help out the family.
For the sake of like the religious upbringing that I had, where we really did believe like you have to obey and honor your parents, and this whole like umbrella of authority thing that they taught, where it's like God and then your parents and then you, and it's like forever. So like you have to get their blessing to do something. It just created this control level where I was conditioned to think like unless my parents could like release us somehow, even from filming, we couldn't stop. So if they weren't okay with it, which at the time, like I was the first Duggar daughter to get married and we were having grandbabies, and like there were lots of high points that we were not okay to stop.
In February of 2016, Jill received news that Jill and Jessa Counting On had been picked up for a second season on TLC. Soon after getting the news, Jill received emails and phone calls from the network and her father notifying her that she needed to come back to Arkansas to do a photo shoot for the show. According to Jill, this was an order she could not obey. After telling both the network and her parents that they could not oblige due to their obligations as missionaries in Central America, Jill was informed that she was, in fact, legally obligated to come back. In her book, she writes, quote, "After several emails, Derick picked up the phone and called Chad. We don't have to come back, he said. Jill isn't obligated to anything. Jill and I have ever only been volunteers." Chad shot back. Jill has a contractual obligation. She has to return. Excuse me? Jill has never signed any contract. The call ended soon after and was followed by an email from Chad outlining what he alleged I was obligated to. Chad referenced a contract that I signed and that the contract was fixed for 5 years. I was confused. Derick was suspicious. Do you remember ever being part of any contract deals with the network? No, I said. Pops always handled all communication with the network. Chad would email Jill and Derick a copy of a signature page of a contract that Jill allegedly signed back in 2014. When Jill received this email, she then remembered having signed a form the day before her wedding. Though at the time she was told by her father that the form pertained to compensation, Jill would later find out that her father deceived her.
I was handed the contract the day before our wedding, and I was not informed of what it was. I did not even have any information. When I asked what it was, I was told this is just about how you're going to get paid. And then, I thought, okay, this is just like an appearance release type thing that we would sign just to, there were seasons with the show where you'd be like, okay, this is just so we can show your face for these episodes, that type of thing. I'm like, I don't know what this is. Okay, but I trusted my dad. So it didn't seem like a big deal. There were no pages to read. It was literally just a signature page. So I didn't think about it until later, years later, when we were asked to come back for a shoot. It must have been, a couple years later. And there was pressure to come back for this promo shoot. And we were like, no, this is one of those things, people knew we were on the mission field in Central America. And we had been dedicated to that work down there. And so we were like, no, this isn't a surprise. We told everybody we were coming down here for this term, this window of time. And our boss had asked us not to return to the States. And we'd made that commitment to him. And it was at that point that contract that I became aware of this contract because they used it as leverage to say, no, you have to come back. You're obligated to. And I was like, hold up, what? I'm not obligated to anything. And they're like, yes, you are. Here you go. And I'm like months later, finally, they gave me a little portion of it, first they send me bullet points and then they're like, oh yeah, actually you are obligated to this. And I was like, what in the world? No, I'm not. And they still wouldn't even send me the whole thing. They would just send me obligations.
A few days after Jill and Derick found out about this contract, they had a heated conversation with Jim Bob. During their conversation, Jim Bob threatened the couple and told them that they were going to get sued if Jill did not follow through with her obligations as outlined in the contract. Despite Jim Bob's threats, Jill and Derick stood their ground and did not fly back for the shoot. The energy between Jill, Derick, and her parents was at an all-time high. In August of 2016, Jill and Derick returned to Arkansas for an extended period of time to attend 2 weddings and film for the show. While there, they found out that Jill was pregnant and expecting their second child. In October of that year, Jim Bob called a family meeting with the older kids, where he shared unexpected news. After months of tension with Jill and Derick regarding money, Jim Bob would inform his children that he would be gifting them each $80,000. In her book, Jill writes, quote, "Pop said, Mom and I have been talking, and some of the boys are getting older and are to the point where they could use some money to help move on in life. And we thought it might be a good idea for you guys to have a little bit of money so that y'all can do what you need to do in life. We want to give you each $80,000. You guys can thank Derick for this. He's been talking to me about paying some of you guys. All I'm going to need is for y'all to sign something. I'm having the paperwork drawn up now. Once you've signed, I'll get you the money." A few weeks later, the paperwork came through. A 4-page agreement emailed over by Chad. The contract wasn't with TLC or any other network. It was with Mad Family Inc., a company that Mom and Pops had set up. In return for the $80,000 for the next 7 years, plus an unlimited number of years beyond that if the company chose, we would have to commit to making not just ourselves, but our children and any children yet to be born available for any show that Mad Family Inc. created or participated in. We would be paid for that work as well, but at a rate that we would have to accept without negotiation. We would also have to sign an NDA, which would remain active for the rest of our lives. $80,000 was a lot of money, but these strings were tight enough to choke.
And we were like puzzled at first, like, what is this for? We also were in this weird position where we didn't want to ask too many questions because they were being, like, everything was being tightly controlled and shut down. Conversations were being shut down. So, but we also knew we were not going to sign anything additional to receive that.
And as far as whether or not it was fair, it was for sure not fair because it was it was a unilateral take it or leave it. There's no discussion. But it wasn't a matter of what was fair, and even after that, it was more about principle and what people were willing to recognize. It was never about what it's worth to us, but I was just curious because so much it was about control, and I just want him to recognize that there's value being added to it because of what we're doing. It wasn't
It seemed
ever
like a one-way street most of the time. It's like, well, I've done this or I've done that.
It was so much about
What about
something that he's doing for us. Like, I'm blessing you guys with this amount of money, and it wasn't ever about compensation or thank you for adding value or you've earned it. It was like, we want to help out each of our kids, so this is something we want to do for each of you guys. So it was never about what was fair or not.
After months of pressuring Jill and Derick to sign the agreement, Jim Bob gave the couple the money despite their refusal to sign the contract. According to Jim Bob, he loved Jill and Derick and wanted to make things right. But the $80,000 would later come back to haunt them. By 2017, Jill and Derick were back in Central America, where they resumed their work as missionaries. While there, they received an offer to expand their work, but they needed to prove that they were no longer obligated to the show. In an effort to demonstrate their commitment as missionaries, Jill and Derick informed the network about their intent to formally resign from the show. In May of 2017, they flew back to Arkansas to film their final scenes and exit interviews. Upon their resignation, the couple requested proof of release, which was requested by the organization that they were set to do missionary work with. Little did Jill and Derick know that this release would be difficult to get. On June 8th, 2017, 1 month after their exit from the show, Jill and Derick welcomed their second son. It was a traumatic birth experience in which Jill suffered from a ruptured uterus and the baby had a stroke, causing bleeding on the brain. This near-death experience for both Jill and baby left Jill feeling troubled and uncertain if she could physically have more kids. According to Jill, in the IBLP, large families were highly favored, while small-sized families were frowned upon. In her book, she writes, quote, IBLP's view was that a lot of people with small families were basically lazy. Feeling overwhelmed, stressed out, or like you couldn't cope with having more kids was no excuse. In fact, the only acceptable approach to the matter was to leave the decision up to God and trust that He would provide the grace to cope. I felt conflicted. I was devastated at the thought of not being able to have more kids, and I felt like my fertility had been robbed from me. But also, dare I say it, I was somewhat relieved. The devastation far outweighed the relief, but there was a small part of me that appreciated the excuse not to have to go through a zillion pregnancies and deliveries. But in my world, big families were everywhere. If you didn't have one, then there was probably something wrong with your body. I hated that I could still feel the involuntary recoil at the stigma.
So IBLP, I would say, like, looking at their group, one of the main things that you would see going to like a conference or something like that would be families with lots of kids, because one of the core teachings was that you're not supposed to limit the number of children that you have. So a lot of families would have 10, 12 kids, as many as their body would, spit out. So at our ages, what was it, like 11 kids?
Yeah, 11 or 12 kids. Her parents had at our age.
I was like,
yeah.
Wow.
I don't even know the math, but I'm like trying to figure. I'm like, okay, 9 months is a standard. I'm like, how does that even happen? Like, that's crazy. There's
my mom
multiples.
would usually get pregnant with the next kid when the baby was like 6 months old. That was like average.
Holy cow.
For her. Like, I feel like it.
That is so wild.
No,
like having
to 10,
no protection, like not even condoms. Like that's not okay. I'm sorry. I don't know. Like literally nothing at all. Or
I mean, I didn't usually have those conversations with my parents, but I know that they did not believe
if we
in contraception.
About using
That's
condoms,
what they would
have
say.
been like,
don't do it.
Yeah.
I'm like, how did my parents do it? Because they have so many kids trying to keep everything afloat. And then, as we got older, I think it just it did evolve into all of us carrying a lot of the weight, like teamwork. Just somebody's in charge of lunch and preparing dinner and breakfast, whatever.
Because you had to also, correct me if I'm wrong, but as a teenager, you almost had to play mom for your younger siblings, right? And help raise them and wake up with them in the night if they woke up and they were crying. Because there's no way that your mom could have taken care of all 19 kids, right?
Yeah. So we had a buddy system where an older child would be paired with a younger sibling or 2 or 3. And that way at home, nobody slipped through the cracks. There was always somebody knowing, like, making sure this one got lunch and this one got their diaper changed. And
when did you change your first diaper? How old were you?
Probably like 6 or something. I don't know.
Yeah, 20-year difference when we first changed our first diapers.
I got my first buddy whenever I was about 6.
And you were 26?
A baby when you were 6?
Yeah, I got my first buddy baby to help take care of. Not as much as I would have later. Like, I didn't do quite as much as I would.
Your next 2 children you took care of more.
Did you wake up in the night with them?
No, I didn't. I wasn't to that level. There's, different levels.
That's so wild.
But my mom actually, during the night, she would keep the itty bitty babies with her in her room. And then even during the night, if we woke up with a kid, they would help. My mom was she's just that nurturing personality. So she was very involved, up through the night and everything with the kids. If somebody's sick, it's her dealing with them. It's not us.
At this time in their lives, so many things were happening that caused Jill to question the belief system she grew up in. When she and Derick quit the show, they moved about 30 minutes away from her family. The distance allowed Jill the space to begin to think for herself. Eventually, she and Derick found a new church outside of the IBLP, where they could meet and interact with people beyond her family and their belief system. In their new church, Jill would be exposed to diversity and people from all walks of life. Contrary to the IBLP, where families dressed, spoke, and smiled the same, Jill's new church provided a range of behaviors for her to observe. It was around this time when Jill began to question the principle of modesty. She had observed women in her new church wear pants, have tattoos and piercings, and still be considered godly women. After much prayer and conversations with her husband, Jill decided to wear pants for the first time in 2017. When Jim Bob found out, he called Jill into his bedroom at the big house and chastised her. He had a bone to pick with her for 2 things. The first was for making the decision to wear pants without consulting him first, like her younger sister Ginger did when she decided to wear pants a few months prior. The second was to reinforce that pants were immodest and could stir up immoral desires in men. With Jill's decision to wear pants, Jim Bob believed that she was behaving in a sinful way by defrauding men. Upon chastising Jill, Jim Bob encouraged her to read a book on clothing and modesty before sending her on her way. According to Jill, this conversation left her feeling embarrassed, humiliated, and ashamed.
I got a question for you, Jim Bob. Do you feel that you have your children's heart?
As far as I know.
It's hard to say that.
As far as I know, yes. We are talking to each one of them, and we're asking questions, and they're responding back. Now, accountability is only as good as someone's honesty, but as far as I know.
Do they seek for your opinion? Does your opinion on things matter to them? Even with the older ones, as far as the music and the culture pressing on them, does your opinion of those things matter to them?
I think when they get married, there's a whole other dynamic of their spouse is the number one. But I think all of them, as far as when they've been in our home, we've all worked through these principles and agreed on them, and it's been wonderful. And even the married ones, I mean, we have a great relationship with each one of them. But it's different dynamic when kids get married, because then I think we've had to learn this. Instead of being a chain of authority, we're actually just a chain of counsel.
Yes, absolutely.
And so you kind of step back and
don't give advice unless it's asked for.
Try not
and
to.
Just try to be that encourager and pray over and pray for, and just be their biggest cheerleader. I think encouraging them to follow Christ.
But what I'm getting at, I'm looking at something. I'm noticing something that, and the reason I asked you the question, do you have their heart? Do they want to know what you think about certain things?
Yes.
Do they, in a sense, admire you for your opinion or your perspective? I've sensed that when I see the two of you together, that you have an admiration for your husband.
Jim Bob's disapproval of Jill and her lifestyle choices would escalate in the coming months. Shortly after she decided to wear pants, Jill got her nose pierced. According to Jill, when Jim Bob found out, he went ballistic. In her book, she writes, quote, "He pleaded with me not to do it. He told me I was making a huge mistake. He begged me to think about how it was going to affect my little sisters. He said I was ruining my life. He'd text verses reminding me to honor thy father and mother. Often he would text me and apologize, but the messages were followed up by more words condemning our actions or calling us out. Hardly a day would go by without some barbed message from him, either directly or from one of my siblings. And it got so bad that I didn't want to talk to him anymore. Days after I'd had my nose pierced, he asked me to have a call with him and Mom. I told him no and put my feelings down in a text. I wrote, "Honestly, I don't really feel like talking. When I feel like there might be a chance I'm just going to be verbally abused, manipulated, and emotionally hurt. It makes me want to stay away from any type of conversation." I don't know what I thought would happen. I guess I'd hoped that Pops would give a genuine apology, but none of that happened. Pops dug in. He hated the hunk of metal in my nose. He despised how I was dressing in ways that put sexual thoughts in guys' minds. Instead of his sweet Jilly muffin, I was now a threat to the rest of his children, and a threat to his authority.
Let me ask you about your family. I want to get back to your dad. You talk in the book, there's a line that really gets me. You say, when you were given away on your wedding day, that was a lie, that you still belonged to your father. You were a married woman. You were a mother, and your dad was still influencing and making decisions about your life. How did that play out for you in terms of being part of this patriarchal system?
Yeah, so I think that everybody kind of faces this whole struggle when you get married and you're trying to, or maybe when you go off to college, like you're trying to find out who am I and how am I separate from the people that raised me or whatever. Like you're trying to find your identity a little bit. So I was going through those normal feelings, but at the same time, there was a whole nother level that I wasn't even aware of that really did make me feel like, wait a second, like this was later, especially after the contract, where I was like, wait a second, why is there this, like a handing off at the marriage altar, but then in reality, it feels like I've got the rug ripped out from under me and I'm still under my dad's control. So, I correlated it almost to like the Bible story that popped in my head was the story of Laban with like Jacob and Rachel and Leah, where he gives, like, there's like a daughter, he has one daughter, but then he like tricks him into marrying the other one. And then he has to work for 7 years for the other daughter. Anyways, it's just this whole thing. And I really felt like that's how it felt. I was lied to. And now I'm being told that I have to, not only with the contract stuff, still be under my dad's control and the filming control, but also my upbringing in IBLP and that whole group. I'm being told that I'm held to a different standard because I know better, because this is the way that I was raised. Spiritually speaking, like if you backtrack or you lower your standards, that's what they would say, like lowering your standards, then you know better because this is the way you're raised and you're supposed to always adhere to these beliefs or whatever. So it's a really weird position that, yeah, it definitely made me feel like I was like given away, but not really.
Moving forward, Jill's relationship with her parents would be fragile. In 2018, Jill and Derick would lose their job offer as missionaries due to the fact that they never received the 2014 contract that Jim Bob had Jill sign in full, which the organization needed for Jill and Derick to begin work. Once again, Jill felt like her father wasn't being transparent, but wanted total control over her life. In an effort to express how they felt, Jill and Derick wrote Jim Bob and Michelle a 27-page letter. According to Jill, Jim Bob's reply was short and confusing. Instead of addressing the issues presented in the letter, Jim Bob apologized for his actions and controlling spirit, lack of sensitivity, and lack of communication. He ended his response with asking for prayers and forgiveness and telling Jill and Derick how much he loved them. But in the summer of 2018, the situation would reach an all-time high when the IRS sent Jill and Derick a letter. In her book, Jill writes, quote, "Derick sat me down and said, 'Remember the $80,000 that Pops paid you?' 'Yeah.' 'I think your dad's accountant has been telling the IRS that you've been receiving income from the show that you haven't actually been paid.' 'What about the $80,000? Doesn't that cover it?' 'Nope. As far as I can tell, over the last 10 years, income from Mad Family Inc. that you've declared to the IRS is way higher than that.' 'Well, how much?' 'About $130,000 more.'"
So in your book, you talk about getting this random IRS document, and then you realize, wait a second, my parents have been saying that they've been paying me out money for X amount of years, and you, with your accounting background, went in, did some digging, and figured out the exact amount that they had claimed, I guess, to have paid you. And so was it at that point where, since you were going back to school, so many things were happening, you were, on paper, it was shown that you were paid this money, so you just decided, hey, I think we should deserve to be paid what was recorded for the IRS, you know?
Yeah, I think it was several things.
Overall, like the biggest takeaway for us was just that there were things being continually hidden. Like we would hit a roadblock, and then her dad, because he was over Mad Family Inc., Jim Bob would basically kind of make it look like he was coming forth and being like, "I'm sorry, this is how it was. Like, you figured this out. Like, we didn't mean this or whatever. We really weren't trying to do anything intentionally. Sorry." And then move on. There'd be something else we'd hit. And it's like, no, there's this other thing. And then it's like, well, if it was
lack of transparency.
There's no transparency, because it's almost like it's better to ask for forgiveness than for permission. And once like we bring something up that we're, should have been made aware of. And that's harmed us. It's not like, oh, well, sorry, we didn't even think about this. Like, there's this other stuff too. And like, if you need to, make a decision based on this other information too, then by all means, like we really didn't mean to like keep this from you, versus like, oh no, like they not figured out, but like they're aware of this. We're going to like dig our heels in and not reveal any other information that could affect your lives.
Basically, it's a lot easier to fess up when you've been caught in it versus just like going above and beyond to just be transparent and say, here's where it's at. Here's what's happening. Like, I'm sorry I did this, but here's this also. And you can only claim the ignorance side of it or accidental oversight so many times. And so for us, when we got this tax document in the mail and then, you know, we're finding out different things, we're finally like, hey, like, we've been screwed over. This is not okay. Here's your opportunity to like prove it to us. Like, prove to us that you want to do what's right. And because like there are consequences for mistakes. So like, okay, if it's a mistake, normally if it's a mistake, you would then come back and be like, I'm so sorry. Let me make it right. So make it right.
Upon receiving this bill from the IRS, Jill and Derick wouldn't see Jim Bob or Michelle for about 3 months as they further investigated the matter. As a consequence for challenging and questioning Jim Bob, Jill and Derick were not allowed at the big house. In an attempt to settle their issues, the foursome met with the mediator. Though their goal was to resolve all conflicts, the meeting wound up being their biggest blow-up yet. In her book, Jill recounts the meeting. Pop said, "You sent me a message, Jill. You said I was verbally abusing you. I was so offended by that too. You know in your heart that's not right. Are you going to apologize for that?" Pops must have sensed what I was thinking because he suddenly stood up. "You're not going to apologize? Really?" Pops took a step toward me. It wasn't a gesture of reconciliation. It was an act of aggression. He towered over me, his whole body fueled with anger. My face flushed with red, my eyes filled with tears. "You know why you're crying, don't you? Your conscience is talking to you, that's why." Pops' voice was so loud in my ears. His words were like blows. I instinctively tried to protect myself and block him out. I curled up on my seat, trying to find safety in some kind of fetal position. "You're guilty," Pops was yelling, stabbing a finger at me, standing right over me. Mom started crying. "You want to know why I'm crying?" My voice cracked. "It's that you think I'm some kind of horrible person just because I wear pants and have a nose ring. That's why I'm crying, Daddy. I'm evolving and changing, but you can't see it. You treat me like I'm a prodigal who's turned her back on you. You treat me worse than you treat my pedo brother." Finally, the moderator stepped in and said, "I think we should take a break." The meeting lasted 3 hours. 3 hours of raised voices, flowing tears from my mother and me, and not much in the way of resolution. We didn't even get to ask about the money. Finally, the mediator said, "You need professional help."
Watching the way that my parents kind of protected my brother, but then used me and some of my sisters, it was hard, and it's still hard to swallow. There's like one point where I call my dad out about it, and I just say, like, "You treat me worse than you treat my brother, my pedophile brother."
That's got to be painful.
It is.
Upon Jill and Derick's explosive sit-down with Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar, the couple began seeing a therapist right away. With the situation at a very toxic point, the therapist advised Jill and Derick to establish boundaries when it came to Jill's family for their own well-being and mental health. In 2019, after years of speculation that Jill and Derick were estranged from the Duggars, Derick would publicly speak out and expose the fact that he and Jill had never been compensated for their time on the show, which ultimately confirmed the public speculation. But Derick's frustration with Jim Bob would escalate upon news that the grants he applied for law school were denied on account of the income that Jim Bob's accountant falsely declared on Jill and Derick's tax returns. In an attempt to recover some of the money, Jill and Derick asked Jim Bob to compensate them for their time on the show.
Like, here's what we're offering. We felt like it was a very like clear cut, like we laid it out clearly. Like, we didn't feel like it was unfair. unjustified.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we made the proposal, we felt like it was a matter of principle.
We knew it was not fair. Like, we knew it wasn't about fairness, but it's not about fairness. It's about principle at this point.
I'm saying fair on the side of like, it wasn't unfair to ask for this. It was not the reasonable fair amount. It was less than that we were asking for, but it was the principle of the thing. Like, okay, you say that you've changed. You say that you want to make things right. What can you do? You're asking us, what can I do to make this right? I feel like there's a wall between us type thing. Like, how can I make this right? And we're like, here's a tangible, like, numbers speak. So here's a tangible number. You can fix this. Here's the error. Fix it. Like, Derick's working in accounting. You know, it's
and
like,
you hadn't even seen the contract yet,
just
right?
to acknowledge
at that point, you weren't even aware of what you signed.
We see these numbers. Derick's, getting ready to go to law school and a lot of times, like, scholarships are based on income, and there's been this income that's been reported in previous years that's not reflecting what our true income is, what we've actually seen. We don't know where those checks went. So, like, we're just like, okay, prove to us by your actions that what you're saying with your words is true. And
like,
so
I would not be surprised, because of like what we share in this book, that after our book Counting the Cost, if Jim Bob Duggar gets another, or if Mad Family Inc. specifically gets another audit, and because of, and gets in
not
trouble.
Our goal.
That's not
like,
our goal.
We're not just like out to
That's
get
not
people.
our goal, but like, because of just how bad things have gotten, like, you don't want it to get to that point. And you hope things get made right before it gets to that point.
After weeks of ignoring their request, Jim Bob finally responded via email. In her book, Jill writes, quote, "We got an email from him, and as I read the opening lines, I felt genuinely surprised. It read, 'Jill and Derick, we love you both and want to see our differences resolved. I have been praying and fasting about all of this. I need to share my heart with you. I have made some bad decisions along life's way and have hurt you all. I am sorry about that. I was wrong for things I have said and done, and I pray you will please forgive me. Yes, we allotted at different times amounts to our children for tax purposes because each one of our children were benefiting from having all of their needs met. Food, clothing, shelter, utilities, music lessons, education, travel, instruments, vehicles, phones, medical insurance, medical bills, etc. Here are some low numbers of what was approximately spent on Jill in the last few years. Most of this was made and spent on Jill before you two were married. Jill, when Mom and I pass on, you are set to receive 1/19 of everything we own that is set up in a trust for you kids. If you attack us, your inheritance will be lowered significantly. I love you, but I am grieved by the disrespect and the accusations that continue. I have asked for forgiveness, and I hope that you will also. You have deeply offended your mother and I. We love you and forgive you for the things you have said and done. $20,000 is a one-time offer. Take it or leave it. Please let me know by Monday night, or the amount will be $0. Love, Daddy Duggar." For all the progress we were making in therapy, that email set us back a long way. It felt cold. It felt brutal. It hurt. It was clear that Pops was not only counting the cost of bringing me into the world, he was set on denying our request.
There are times that, I've had a hard time. Like I told Derick, I think it wasn't even like conscious at first. It was just this like processing thing that I was really going through some difficult times. And, a lot of times people will say you kind of can look at God the same way that you look at your father. So I feel like whenever I first started having conflict with my dad, it was something that I had to process and work through just my relationship with my dad and realizing that that doesn't have to define me. It also doesn't have to define the way that I view God. And so processing that, for a while, I couldn't even call God my father because it was too triggering. because my own father and my relationship with him was very rocky.
In October of 2019, Jill and Derick hired a lawyer who sent a demand letter to Jim Bob requesting the 2014 contract that Jill had unknowingly signed. When Jim Bob received the letter, he was enraged. According to Jill, not only did he refuse to send over the contract, but he also pitted her siblings against her, telling them that if they didn't stand against Jill and Derick, they were going to be sued. With most of her siblings against her, Jill was at one of the lowest points in her life. The way she saw it, there wasn't much hope. But in November the following month, the person she least expected to step in did. In her book, Jill writes, quote, "I woke up one night to the sound of our storm door opening. Someone started hammering on the door. It was 12:15 in the morning. My heart was instantly hammering in my chest. I was at the window. I couldn't see who was out there, but there was a car out on the street. A car that I recognized. It's Mom's car," I said. Whoever had been hammering and knocking on the door gave up, turned around, and walked back to the car. It was Mom. She'd never done anything like that before. Nobody in my family had. And I stared out the window at her, frozen. I watched her go. A long 15 minutes later, we got a text. "Jill and Derick, we love you all. I took the Discovery contract in its entirety to your house late last night. I apologize for going by so late. I left it in between your screen door and front door. Mom." Inside was a copy of the contract from 2014, all 30 pages of it. It stated that for each half-hour episode, Mad Family Inc. would be paid $50,000, and for each 1-hour episode, $65,000, with the numbers rising to $58,000 and $73,000 if the show hit a 4th season. Pops later determined somehow that each child would receive 3% on their tax returns each year. However, even this was a phantom payment, seemingly just reported on paper for tax purposes, with no apparent intention to actually pay out the amount. We did the numbers. Over the years, there had been well over 300 shows, for which we estimated that TLC had paid Mad Family Inc. over $8 million total. Our wedding alone had netted well over $100,000 for Pops, and Israel's birth had been the focus of 2 special episodes, earning Pops another 6-figure sum. Yet, when we'd asked him to cover our $10,000 deductible and out-of-pocket expenses from the hospital stay, he refused. Pops had bought more and more properties, and his fleet of private aircraft now contained multiple airplanes, including one with 10 seats. It wasn't until January that things were finally resolved. We got some, but not all, of the Mad Family Inc. documents. We didn't sign an NDA or anything of that nature. And though we hadn't asked for what we felt was the true value of what I had provided to the show, at least it would help me recover what was owed to me that had been reported on my taxes, plus cover attorney fees, as well as buy me out of my shares and future profits of Mad Family Inc. I felt like my parents and most of my siblings thought I was greedy and that Derick and I were horrible people for what we'd done to the family. Maybe they were right. I never knew that victory could feel so hollow or so overwhelmingly sad.
Didn't you think that was strange, though? That you had donated 12 years of your life to television and you never saw a dime of that?
Yes, but I was also very conditioned. That's like one of the things about it. Like, you're conditioned to think, oh, well, this is just...
It's a ministry. It's an obligation.
Ministry.
Right. You thought you were just sharing how you live with the world and showing the world.
I knew that there was money being made like that because... obviously, like, my family's lifestyle had changed over the years and evolved. Even though they don't get it in the moment, we're just like, we're not greedy. We're just saying, this is what you reported on taxes that I earned. So this is what is like, I should be allowed to recover because it was reported on my taxes that I never received.
And I think another factor is sons and daughters are treated very differently in this culture. And with Jill being a daughter, it was very different than whenever some of her brothers got to the point that we were at years before.
I really hope that things get better and not worse. Like, I don't have any like ill intent like for my family. I love my family, but we do have to have like some boundaries in place and stuff. But I hope that things get better as a result of like what we've been through.
Okay, so you say no ill will, but I am curious if you harbor any sort of resentment towards your father.
Yeah, I would say like my relationship with my father, there were very hurtful things that happened, and I've chosen to forgive him and to hopefully move on with better boundaries and better rules in place, I guess you could say. So that hopefully that level of control and hurt won't be allowed to happen again. Yeah. Because I feel like I didn't have very good boundaries. I didn't know what that could look like. And
how are things with you and your mom? Do you ever resent that she stood by him during all these really difficult trials in your life?
Growing up in the group that I did and just my own story, I can see how there are like some of the ways that my mom might have behaved in certain situations. It makes sense to me why things were handled that way.
Because that was her teaching.
Yeah, and just like you're in this predicament, you know? So I try and keep my mom out of the middle of it. Now, at first I think she kind of felt like she had to fit in the middle and work things out or whatever. But as we've processed and really lived our story more, I felt like it kind of relieves her of that pressure and doesn't make her have to be the go-between between like me and my dad or whatever. If she can just be mom or be grandma.
So you have a very separate relationship with your mom.
It is very
than
separate
from your dad. Okay.
I try to keep it that way because I think it's healthier right now.
Moving forward, Jill and Derick's relationship with the Duggar clan would be rocky. Though Jill and Derick were estranged from the family, their lives would be disrupted once again when on March 5th, 2021, Homeland Security agents showed up at Jill's house to inquire about her brother, Josh Duggar. A few days later, Josh Duggar was arrested and charged with downloading and receiving child SA material. According to Jill, not only was it shocking and devastating to hear what her brother had been charged with, but the timing couldn't have been worse. It had been over 5 years since In Touch magazine illegally released the police report detailing Josh's past abuse of Jill and some of her sisters. In an attempt to seek justice, Jill and her sisters sued those responsible for the release. After years of their case being continued, they finally had a court date for December 2021, which just so happened to coincide with Josh Duggar's impending trial for child SA material. To make matters worse, Jill was on the prosecution's witness list, meaning she could be called to testify against her brother. During all of this chaos, Jill and Derick discovered that they were expecting. Unfortunately, however, in September of 2021, Jill miscarried. The loss of their baby was heartbreaking, but 2 months later, they found out they were expecting again. It was November of 2021, and Josh's trial was set to begin. In her book, Jill details this dark period of her life, writing, quote, "I'd been told that I could receive a call at any point and be required to testify against him. That was a sobering thought, a little terrifying at times, but I was willing to do it. I had thought about what Josh had done and reached a clear conclusion. After years and years of following the family line and trusting Pops when he said that things were better dealt with within the family, I wanted something different to happen. I wanted to know the truth. I wanted the evidence to come out, and I wanted Josh to be put away for a very long time. I felt anger at what he'd done, So much anger it burned. He had hurt innocent children by his actions, and then continued to avoid responsibility. I felt sad, too. Sad that Josh had become a monster. Sad that even with all the chances Josh had been given to change, he had thrown them away as he continued down a dark, terrible road. Like the rest of the world, I was finally able to see my eldest brother for what he was, a man unable to control himself, totally detached from reality of how deeply he was hurting others. In the past, he had apologized for looking at adult pornography. Now that he had walked into deeper and darker sins, he seemed to grow less remorseful. He never admitted to the crimes he committed, never expressed any guilt or remorse. Derick was there for the verdict. They found him guilty, he said. In the end, all I could manage to say was, I think they got it right.
In 2021, Josh was convicted of receiving child pornography and is now serving 12 and a half years in prison. Derick attended court every day.
What was the kaleidoscope of emotions?
There was a lot of surprise, anger, just bewilderment, disbelief that people could believe that this didn't happen, because to me the evidence was so clear.
You, in the book, call Josh a monster. Mm-hmm. And say that you wanted him to be put away for a very long time. Mm-hmm. Do you feel like you'll ever reach out to your brother?
I have one time, just because I didn't know what to do. So I sent like a handmade Christmas card to him, but then it got sent back. I don't think I'm on his list.
In a statement to ABC News, Jim Bob and Michelle Duggar said, "We aim to deal honorably with our children, our finances, and our endeavors. While imperfect, it is our intent and desire to live a life that honors Christ. We do not believe the best way to resolve conflicts, facilitate forgiveness and reconciliation, or to communicate through difficulties is through the media or in a public forum, so we will not comment further."
With Josh Duggar's trial over, it was now time for Jill to focus on her case against the city of Springdale, Arkansas, and those responsible for leaking the police report. But what started out as a winnable case soon became a nightmare for Jill and her sisters, as it became clear that Josh Duggar's case and trial would severely impact theirs. In her book, Jill writes, quote, "I'd hoped that the lawsuit would bring closure and healing to that most painful part of my life. But what started out as a winnable case suddenly became weak once my brother appeared in court. Our case was derailed by everything that happened with Josh. The fact that we were due to appear in the same court before the same judge, likely with jurors drawn from the same jury pool, means that we were tied to him. It was another painful twist of the knife to be linked to our abuser like this. But there was nothing we could do. After Josh's trial revealed the continued secrecy in our family and the lack of acknowledgement of wrongdoing, the judge and everyone around grew skeptical of anything to do with the Duggars. They lumped us all together, and despite the fact that our case was strong, we could feel the tide turning against us, even though we were suing those who the judge agreed had illegally released the reports of our abuse and then exploited us as victims of child SA. In many people's eyes, the court had already declared who the real culprit was: Josh. In February 2022, the judge dismissed our case. We had lost. It was all over.
As though the trauma of being a victim is not enough. It was made 1,000,000 times worse when the world had to find out about it. What kind of a toll did that take on you?
I think the world did not have to find out about it. What makes this sting that much worse is that this isn't something that, what makes it hard too is these are people who are antagonistic. These are people who don't view you the way that other people view you. They, might have been your enemy up to that point, and people will say, well, you're public, so this is your fault. And Jill never chose that. That wasn't ever chosen. And I do hold, to some extent, I think, I don't know, we might feel differently about this, Jill and I, but like, I do feel that it was partly her parents' fault knowing what was going on and continuing on with the show the way that they did.
Yeah. But the people that we hold responsible, as we've outlined in the book, for the release of
Oh, it's absolutely,
the records.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I think it's almost like they're complicit. Like, there were bad actors in the family, bad actors in the media, bad actors in city government, county government, all created the perfect storm.
My heart really goes out to you. I can't even imagine how challenging it must have been to recount all of that in your book.
This is something that nobody should have known about. So that's
Right.
the point. So that's why I don't like talking about, continuing to talk about the things that should never have been out there.
But I do want to advocate for victims and just again say how victims should never have to be put in the position that I was put in, and what happened in my life, in my story, with these records being exposed, was illegal, and so I was very clear in our book about talking about the judge's opinion and the judge siding with us and saying, that what happened was illegal and should have never happened.
And I talk to victims almost on a weekly basis, and there are child advocacy centers, child safety centers, some version of that in every state. And anyone who's in that position and has someone pull them into a room and go into an interview with them, and a child who's gone through a very traumatic situation, and they hear somebody say, "This is a safe place, you can share with us and it will not get out of this room," is a lie. They cannot guarantee that.
Upon the upsetting news that Jill's case had been dismissed, she and Derick would pick up the pieces and move on with their lives, because life must go on. And on July 7th, 2022, Jill and Derick welcomed their third son, Freddie, via C-section. While at home recovering from the birth with her mother by her side, Jill had a surprise visitor when her father stopped by. Though their relationship had been strained for years, Jill loved her father, and seeing him meet his new grandson for the first time gave Jill hope that in time they could find their way back to each other. In closing out her book, here are some of Jill's final thoughts. Quote, "I am grateful, but I am also realistic. There is much that I can look back on and smile, but I picked up some wounds along the way. It's like roses and thorns, justice and grace. You can recognize the beauty and happy parts of your story while also recognizing the more difficult parts. The two can coexist. The highs aren't automatically erased or invalidated by the lows. Getting out cost us, but it was worth it. It was worth it to find freedom from the guilt and the fear. It was worth it to learn how to think for myself. It was worth it to discover that standing up for myself or others isn't a sin or an act of disobedience. It's a mark of freedom, of self-respect, of dignity. In learning to treat myself more kindly, I am discovering that it's possible to do the same for others as well."
Yeah, there are a lot of critics who will say, like, "Oh, but look at all you got from the show," or "Look at all the perks you had for being on the TV show." And to them, I would say, you can, just because your situation is not as bad as the next person's, does not invalidate where you are. And I think that's for anybody's story. Like, just because your abuse or just because your hardships are not as bad as the next person doesn't mean that you're not being harmed or that there's not a problem that you're facing that you need help with. And then I would say too, that there can be positives and negatives and they can both coexist very well. So like I point out in the book, like there are a lot of happy memories. I love my family. I love a lot of the memories that we've had together. does that make it right over here that like all these negative things have happened? No. So I compare it a lot to roses and thorns, where there are beautiful moments, they're like roses, and then there are thorns, and it doesn't have to be completely one way or another. Like they can coexist, and the highs should not automatically be erased by the lows, but also like vice versa. I was very happy to put in there what this book is not, and it's not like me trying to like change my family or as a part of the reconciliation process. I'm not just bashing my family. I love my family. I think that's another reason why it's taken us so long to write this book. One, because we've been living our story, but two, also because I love my family and I really care about them. And it carried a lot of weight for me to be able to just even put these words into a book. And I wanted to do it accurately and carefully. So I know it isn't guaranteed to be well received, but yeah, I think we're playing the long game here and really just hoping for better relationships in the future. And hopefully people will find encouragement in their own stories, just by knowing they're not alone and helping them find their voice maybe.